Patty Hearst was a billionaire heiress kidnapped by terrorists. Then she willingly joined them. The reason why shocked the world. Welcome to History Snob. Patty Hearst's name still stirs controversy to this day, more than 40 years after the shocking events of this story. The story of her kidnapping, her involvement with the Symbionese Liberation Army, and her bombshell trial remains one of the most puzzling and provocative chapters in American history. As you watch this video, keep a question in the back of your mind. Was Patty Hearst a victim? Or was she a perpetrator? And let us know what you think in the comments below. Your answer at the end of the video may be different than your answer at the beginning. Then again, it may not. It was February 4th, 1974, a night that would change everything for 19-year-old Patricia Hearst. Patty, the granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, was a college student at Berkeley at the time. She came from a world of privilege, a world of power and wealth. But on that cold February evening, she would be thrust into a nightmare. As she was in her apartment in the affluent area of Berkeley, California, armed men burst into her home, kidnapping her at gunpoint. The group that took her wasn't just any gang of criminals. They were the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a radical left-wing militant organisation that, in their eyes, was fighting for social justice, the overthrow of the US government, and an end to racial inequality. They were perhaps most infamous for their violent tactics, including robberies, shootings, and their demands for the release of political prisoners. Patty was forced into a van and driven away, her cries for help unheard. For her, the world as she knew it had just collapsed into chaos. What happened next would baffle the nation. As the days turned into weeks, the kidnappers demanded a ransom of $300 million worth of food to be distributed to the poor. In response to this, Hearst's famous father, Randolph Hearst, was able to secure a loan for $2 million and began arranging the setup through a project called People in Need. But it was a logistical shambles, and thanks to the poor organisation, the SLA refused to release her. At first, there was no indication that Patty would survive this ordeal. Her family pleaded with the public to help locate her, but the SLA had different plans for their captive. They would later send out tapes of Patty in which she spoke of her revolutionary consciousness and her admiration of the SLA. It was almost as though she had become a completely different person in a matter of days. How could a young woman from such an elite background suddenly transform into someone who seemed to embrace the radical cause of people who kidnapped her? Was this genuine transformation, or was Patty simply under duress and forced to act against her will? Before we can dive into Patty's behaviour and the eventual legal consequences, we need to take a step back and understand the group responsible for her abduction, the Symbionese Liberation Army. Founded in 1973 by Donald DeFreeze, the SLA was a ragtag collection of urban guerrillas, many of whom were marginalised from communities. They were not just anti-government, they were anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, and fiercely critical of the war in Vietnam. The SLA combined elements of radical black power movements like the Black Panther Party with Marxist-Leninist rhetoric. Donald DeFreeze, who went by the alias Sunk, was a former prisoner who had escaped custody and was deeply involved in the group's ideology. Other members of the group, including Patricia's captors, were motivated by similar convictions. They believed the American government was oppressive, and they believed violence was justified in the fight for liberation. But despite their revolutionary ideals, the SLA's methods were controversial, even among radical activists. They resorted to violence, including the murder of a school superintendent, Marcus Foster, and the robbing of a bank, as well as a string of kidnappings and bombings. Patty Hearst's kidnapping was not a one-off. It was part of a larger plan to achieve political ends by using high-profile hostages to grab media attention. Patty, with her famous name and connection to wealth, became the perfect symbol for their cause. But she would end up bringing them more attention and controversy than they ever could have imagined, and her own actions would prove impossible to explain. Soon after Patty Hearst was taken by the SLA, reports began to emerge suggesting that she was undergoing a radical change. Tapes were released in which she professed her admiration for the captors. In one of these recordings, Patty declared, "I am a soldier in the army of the Symbionese Liberation Army." As strange as it seemed, the shift in attitude mirrored what psychologists would later call Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where hostages developed positive feelings, empathy, or even love towards their captors. For over 2 months, Patty was isolated from her family, threatened with violence, and exposed to intense ideological conditioning. And at one point, the SLA even filmed Patty handling a weapon during a bank robbery, and the footage showed her confidently brandishing a rifle, seemingly with ease with her new life. She seemingly went from being a kidnapped victim, locked in a closet, subjected to constant threats and abuse, to firing a gun in the support of her kidnappers. Testimony gathered by Jeffrey Toobin, author of the book American Heiress, that documents the case, states, in reference to sexual relations she had with her kidnappers, well, certainly. In the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping, this was pure terrorism, and she had no part in it. But after a few weeks, there was a bond that developed between Patricia and her kidnappers. It seemed that only a significant time had passed before Hearst subscribed to the SLA's doctrine, including their free love stance. But could all that really be explained away by brainwashing? Or was there something more sinister at play? One of the most infamous moments in Patty Hearst's saga came in April 1974, just 2 months after her abduction. Patty, who had now allegedly adopted the SLA's revolutionary ideology, took part in a bank robbery in San Francisco. Armed with a machine gun, Patty entered the bank with another member of the SLA, robbing it of nearly $10,000. The crime was captured on camera, and in the footage, Patty is seen to be wielding a weapon. Her demeanour seemed far from the terrified young woman who had been kidnapped just weeks earlier. In fact, she appeared calm and composed, almost as though she had joined the group voluntarily. This event rocked the nation. How could a young woman raised in one of the wealthiest families in America become an accomplice into a robbery for the relatively paltry sum of $10,000? Adding to the strangeness, Patty had changed her name. She declared that she was now to be known by nom de guerre Tanya. This only added to the mystery of what was going on in Patty's head. But the public wouldn't have to wait long to get a close look at her. The government was closing in. The final chapter of Patty Hearst's ordeal came in 1975 in September, when she was arrested in a Los Angeles apartment, more than a year after her kidnapping. By this time, the SLA had been almost completely dismantled by law enforcement, and many of its members were dead or in custody. Patty, however, remained an enigma. The media portrayed her as both a victim and a criminal, and her story captivated the nation's attention. At her trial in 1976, Patty's defense team argued that she had been coerced into participating in the crimes by her captors, and that she had no real choice in the matter. Patty herself, while not denying her involvement, continued to assert that she was a victim of brainwashing and fear. The prosecution, however, was not so sympathetic. They painted Patty as a willing accomplice, someone who had made a conscious decision to join the SLA's violent crusade. Prosecutor Browning argued that Hearst must be lying, and that she would have participated in the robberies without coercion. For one thing, he argued, the SLA was a self-professed feminist, and so would not have allowed Patty to be assaulted as she says happened. Not only that, but it was said that Hearst kept a locket for months that was given to her by Wolf, the man she was accusing of these crimes, suggesting that she had a romantic connection with him and she was lying about the whole thing. In the end, the jury convicted Patty Hearst of robbing the bank and felony assault, and she was sentenced to 35 years in prison. However, after serving just 2 years in federal prison, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence in 1979, citing her time already served. So, was the justice system too harsh on Patty, or did she escape accountability for her actions? Was her sentence an unjust consequence of her manipulation, or was it the right decision for her role in the crimes? Patty Hearst's story is a difficult one to unravel. Her case touches on a broader issue of free will, brainwashing, and personal agency. It forces us to confront questions that are not easily answered. How much control do we have over our own actions in extreme circumstances? And to what extent can an individual be held responsible for their behaviour if they were subjected to coercion? The case of Patty Hearst also raises uncomfortable questions about the justice system. Was her trial fair, considering the unique circumstances of her case? Her psychological state, the nature of her captivity, and the radical environment she was immersed in all made it difficult to assess her culpability. Yet, the system did not offer any leniency. Patty's case was so famous that people had already made their minds up about her before she went on trial, and it proved literally impossible to find a jury that had not heard the story. In a court of public opinion, Patty was both vilified and sympathised with, depending on one's political leanings. Ultimately, Patty Hearst's legacy is a mixed one. She was a young woman who survived an unimaginable ordeal, and in the process she became a symbol of both victimhood and complicity. Over the years, she has sought to distance herself from the SLA's past, speaking out about her experiences in interviews and memoirs. But the question remains, was Patty responsible for her actions? Or was she just another victim of a ruthless and manipulative organisation? As of today, Patty Hearst lives a relatively quiet life, far removed from the media frenzy that surrounded her in the 1970s. She has publicly acknowledged her involvement with the SLA, but she has also expressed regret over the things she was made to do. Patty Hearst's life and the events surrounding her kidnapping and involvement with the Symbionese Liberation Army are a reminder that history is often far more complicated than it appears on the surface. In the search for answers, we often want to categorize people as either heroes or villains, victims or perpetrators, but the reality is often murkier than that. Patty Hearst's transformation challenges our understanding of human psychology, personal responsibility, and the power of radical ideologies to warp the human mind. Whether she was a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, a young woman who genuinely became convinced of the SLA's cause, or someone who acted out of fear and survival instincts, the fact remains that her story is one that defies easy answers. So, was Patty Hearst responsible for her actions or not? The answer may never be clear, and perhaps it's not something we can easily resolve. But what is certain is that her story remains one of the most compelling and controversial episodes in American history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complicated life of Patty Hearst. If you found this video intriguing, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Let us know in the comments what you think. Was Patty Hearst a victim? Or did she have more agency than we care to admit? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, this is History Snob, reminding you that history isn't always as simple as it seems.